I welcome today my guest, Karen Kendra, to trailblazersimpact.com. And on behalf of my co-host, Nan McKay, and myself, I thank you so much for your willingness to share with our listeners how to get started writing your memoirs. As sort of a backdrop for the listeners, I met Karen about 2 years ago in a writing class through our community college where she facilitates the personal efforts of people who have long thought about writing their memoirs but didn't quite know how to get started. And I've invited Karen today to join us expressly for the purpose of helping others to understand that it's not as hard nor as daunting as it sounds. So, Karen, by way of background, can you share with the listeners a little bit about your background, where you grew up, a little bit about your early life journey, and then at what age and stage did you become committed to writing your own memoirs? And then how did that launch you into becoming an instructor on how to write your personal memoirs?
Okay, well, I was born to two Marines. My dad and my mom were both Marines. I was born in Philadelphia, although I spent some time, I'm told, in a dresser drawer in Norfolk, Virginia. I'm the oldest of six siblings. I grew up later in Levittown, Pennsylvania, and later in my life I moved to New Hampshire. I married, had two sons. I lost my first husband to lung cancer, remarried again, and ended up in the DC area, where I started to take writing classes because I didn't know who I was when I was retired. I had been a nurse since I was 19. So I had to find out who I was going to be for the rest of my life. And after taking a few courses, and specifically writing courses, I decided I'm going to be a writer of some sort, not to write a book, but just to record my experiences, my thoughts on things.
What type of classes did you start with when you said you launched it by first thinking, I'm going to take some classes?
Well, I was taking some history classes, political classes, and then I zeroed in on the creative writing, and one of those instructors was doing a memoir writing class as well. So I started doing that, and when I ran into an old friend at a high school reunion, I told her that I had found it difficult in Maryland, at least on the internet, to find anything similar to what I'd seen in Arlington, Virginia. And she whipped out a brochure for Peer Learning Partnership, which is affiliated with the community college over in Annapolis. And that started the ball rolling, really.
Okay. Well, in the context of when you got started in writing your memoir, can you share with us again your background and some of the portions of your life's journey that you started writing about?
Well, I've always loved to write. I wrote for the high school newspaper and the literary magazine. I won an essay contest in my junior year. And then as I got into nursing, I wrote the class history for a graduating class. And then later on, it was mostly professional writing, but I still enjoyed it. And I did later open my own business as a certified legal nurse consultant, where I worked with attorneys on malpractice cases and such, and I would write reports for them. So I've always been writing something.
So now taking it to a more personal level, share some of the things you wrote about when you started writing your memoirs. What portions of your life did you start with, and what are the things that you remember now that you committed to paper as part of the memoirs?
Well, I really started when I was at a family reunion, and I overheard quite accidentally my father telling one of his cousins about his complicated entry into the Marine Corps in World War II. He'd signed up for the draft, they lost the paperwork, he went back, they said, oh, your name is here, wait till we call you. He finally got into the Marine Corps, but I thought, this is a story that none of my siblings knew. So I wrote that down, and I continued to interview my father. And another thing that's really vivid in my memory is my Uncle Chris, who was a radio engineer for a radio station in Philadelphia, and he always admired Albert Einstein. And I only found out a couple years before he died that he had actually interviewed Albert Einstein. in Princeton, New Jersey, and he was hired, sent by the company to record Einstein's speech. And in the process, the tape recorder would not work, and so he had to go into another room. And Albert Einstein came into the room, sat down with him, and proceeded to ask my uncle all kinds of questions. And my uncle laughingly said to me, he said, "I didn't think I had to explain the theory of magnetism to Albert Einstein." But he said, "I think he was just a really nice man trying to diffuse the moment." So that was such an interesting story that I wrote about that. Actually, my Uncle Chris asked me to write it down because we had encouraged him to put it into Physics Today magazine. They did not publish it, but it was published in my husband's workplace newsletter. So important stories like that, it was accidental that I overheard them, and it started to feed my interest in finding more about my family and writing about my own life.
Well, you'll see that our tagline for Trailblazers Impact is Ordinary Women, Extraordinary Achievement. So I have to believe that somewhere you must have written something about your mom becoming a member of the U.S. Marines. And I'm curious right now, what have you shared or what can you share that your mother may have shared with you or other family members about how she decided to become a part of the U.S. Marine Corps? What years are we talking about your mother being a Marine? And then what were the sort of the takeaways that you remember from stories she may have told you about being a woman in the Marines way back when, question mark. So I would like to start with, when was your mother a Marine?
She joined the Marines, I believe, in 1941. She met my father there. They both worked in Norfolk, Virginia. And my father was desperately trying to get overseas. He just didn't want to be bound to a desk job. And he was turned down a few times and finally was told that he could go overseas. Of course, my mother was upset. By then they had committed to each other. And his orders were pulled at the last minute. So he would have been on Iwo Jima had he gone. That was where his unit had gone. So I always found that really interesting. My mother did clerical work, and she didn't talk a whole lot about, she made a lot of good friends, and she always went to the Marine Corps reunions. In fact, her name is on the Women's Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. I took the granddaughters to see that. And they talked about how proud they were that she had signed up for service. She was very patriotic.
And how many years did she spend in the Marine Corps?
Well, she left in about 3 or 4 because back then, she and my father married in 1944, and she became pregnant with me. And of course, they were dishonorably discharged. If women were pregnant, they were honorably discharged. I'm sorry.
Thank you, because I was just going to stop you and say, well, there's a story there. I didn't know it was a dishonorable discharge. But so she was honorably discharged based upon the pregnancy.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. What are your reflections now about a woman in the military being honorably discharged for pregnancy?
I don't think that happens now.
Right.
I believe so, but so.
Yeah. No, no, I don't believe it does either, but I'm saying it's probably because of the trail that women like your mother blazed that made it possible for women to go into service, continue their military service, even though they were married and having children. So again, I have to say, as opposed to you being first generation trailblazer, it sounds like you're second generation trailblazer, that your mom was the real trailblazer that made way for lots of women who chose military careers going forward. So I'm glad that you shared that with us about your mom's tenure and how she got discharged based on being a married woman and having a baby. It was grounds for discharge. So then I want to fast forward to where you are now as a instructor or facilitator for writing at the community college, and again specific to your course title, for example. What is your course title, and what reflections do you have, having now taught for several years with people who come in the door evidently interested, or they wouldn't have signed up? And any stories that you can tell us about some of the outcomes of leading people to that point where they actually start writing?
Well, the nice thing about the Peer Learning Partnership is that you do not have to be a teacher in order to facilitate a class. So that was an opening for me. I don't have teaching credentials. So it was a way of getting involved. And when my friend Tony and I, who had introduced me to PLP, started with a creative writing class based on prompts that people would bring in, there was an interest among the members to continue on. So we formed a special interest group where the focus turned to memoir writing. And there were so many interesting stories. One in particular was a woman who had worked a Jewish woman who had worked in Baltimore with the German prisoners of war who were over there. Now, I had no knowledge of this beforehand, but she thought it was ironic that a young Jewish girl was teaching things to German prisoners of war. So there were just so many wonderful stories that I decided that many more people should be telling those stories. We don't sit around the fireside anymore and tell stories to each other. Geographically, we're separated from our family many times. And people are on these busy schedules. So we really do have to record our stories. When we're gone, those stories are lost. And it is hard to get started because a lot of people think that starting a chronological life story is just daunting. Well, our lives are not A to B to Z. They are a series of small stories that make up the tapestry of our lives, to use a well-worn phrase. The first thing I start with is a diagram of a neighborhood they lived in childhood. And it's become such a great beginning because sometimes people don't always think back on the neighborhood they lived in and the weird people who lived down the street or the favorite dog that was living there. And it's a jump start for them. They like remembering those times.
Are there any others? I'm fascinated myself now with the story of the lady in your class who reflected on being a young Jewish woman in Baltimore and providing instruction to German prisoners of war. So these were German prisoners of war that had been brought from Europe to the United States?
That's correct. Yes.
Well, that is an interesting story and something new for me. Can you remember one or two others that really have captured you or fascinated you that you found through your writing class?
Well, your story was, I thought, quite interesting, Dee.
Okay.
The fact that you were an Army brat and that you grew up all over, but when you talked about your time in Detroit and some of the personalities the celebrities that you met. So you had an interesting story. Another person emigrated from Austria just at the beginning of the Nazi purges. And he had some really interesting stories to tell about his early days in the United States. There were just so many of them. In fact, someone you've already interviewed, Carolyn, who worked in Washington, she had some interesting stories. And I'm so glad people come to these because you learn a lot about our country that you may not have known, or customs or practices that you may not have been aware of beforehand. So it's a great experience for me, and I think for everyone in the class when they hear these different points of view and experiences.
Yes, and I was sitting here just reflecting on one of my earliest interviews being Carolyn, and she was within the first 5 women that I interviewed for Trailblazers Impact, and her story I found quite fascinating. She's now up in her 80s, and she talked about knowing JFK before he was essentially President JFK. She knew him from her work on Capitol Hill as a very young woman, and he was a young junior senator from Massachusetts, and then later she worked for the State Department and went on to have a very responsible position under Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State. So I found just being a participant in your class and hearing the stories that people would read from the excerpts from the assignments that you gave us were eye-opening. So I can imagine as an instructor now or facilitator for a number of years, all the stories that you've been able to capture or benefit from hearing. Recently, the two of us were reunited through the peer learning partnership this fall in the anti-racism discussion group. And as a backdrop, of course, the national conversation has gone in a very large way to what they call, America having a reckoning with its history and current attitudes around race relations in the United States. If you would please, can you share some of your motivation for joining the anti-racism discussion group, and through the first session that we've had now as a larger group, what were some of your takeaways?
Well, I've always been startled, I guess, or stunned by the existence of racism. I grew up in a family who, in retrospect, I consider anti-racist, but there are so many definitions now, as we've heard from the book that we're following with that discussion group, Kendi's book called Stamped from the Beginning. So it's a chance for us all to really examine ourselves, our lives, our exposure. And it depends too on where we all come from. So it was interesting that they began with where were you raised, because it certainly has had a lot to do with our perceptions and prejudices as we've grown up. It's a fascinating subject. It certainly is America's shame, even though it started way before that. I was incredibly surprised that it started back as far as Aristotle, and it's been perpetuated for all these years. So it's a wonderful opportunity to find out where other people are and what we can do about it. Where can we start? How can we ever overcome it?
You made reference to the different definitions associated with the discussion around racism and anti-racism from the Kendi book, Stamped from the Beginning. Can you share one or two of the definitions that you recall or that resonate with you?
Well, the anti-racist is, of course, what most of us like to think we are. And then there are the segregationists, who are the people who I suppose that makes them, they want a total division between the races. And the assimilationists are those who feel that if Black people had better exposure to culture or lived in a different place, things might be better for them. And so there were things that I had not considered, that there were degrees of racism.
And I would like to add to that, particularly around the assimilationists, that in reading Kendi's book, it was even an eye-opener for me in the context of assimilationists being applicable to even persons of color, that there are not just white people who believe that the Black condition, so to speak, or the races would get along better if Blacks were more like whites, so to speak, meaning assimilation, but Black people who believe that, well, we ought to act more like them. We ought to work harder at looking more like them, that doing what they do. And that in and of itself is also a form of racism, because it means you're anti, i.e. against your own identity. And so assimilationism as a academic definition was really something that struck me in the reading of our first section of the Kendi book, Stamped from the Beginning. So when you made the reference earlier to, in this conversation today, about assimilationists and assimilationism, I thought, yeah, that's the one that really struck a chord with me as well. So I'm looking forward to our journey in the discussion group, and I'm hoping that you and I, as sort of opposite sides of the same coin, meaning two women in the same age bracket, with the same interest, which is advancing the conversation. And it is an uncomfortable conversation amongst race, between the races about racism, that maybe we can have another interview. And at the end of our time, this discussion group, I know is going to go on probably this year and into next year, from what I understand. But at a future date, sharing our reflections on other things that we've learned and our perspective on hearing some of the same things, but maybe having a difference of where, or an intersection between both, where we find the same interests or the same outcomes, as well as different outcomes about our thinking around it. So I was so glad to see that you were in the anti-racism discussion group, and then there I was as well. What are some of your next pursuits? What's next for Karen Kendra, either in the context of helping people to become writers, or do you have another interest that you're pursuing?
Well, I'm also trying to add to my own memoirs, and I've become a pretty prolific writer. My writing group people tease me that I never write less than 4 or 6 pages when we do our essay writing every other week. But I'm just not just family history, but my impressions on things, my impressions about COVID, the national issues with it, the treatment of it. So I'm doing that. I'm trying to catch up on the life stories of my family. I lost my father last year. Fortunately, my grandchildren got to know him, but I've been trying to write stories about my first husband because his grandchildren never got to meet him. So that occupies a lot of my time. COVID has been helpful in making me sit down at the computer and follow these.
So at this point, I guess you describe yourself as a writer? It sounds like you are a writer.
I guess that's what my second career has become.
Right. And so how long was the journey from when you were first very tentative about starting to write your memoirs to now 2000 to 2020, and you are a writer? How many years did this journey take?
Oh, I would say about 7 or 8 years.
So it is possible to go from just thinking about being a writer to actually becoming a writer.
It is possible, but you do have to have some discipline. I think if I were to give any advice to people, I would say keep a notebook. And when these stories that you overhear or things that you think of come to mind, write them down. If you can't get to them today, you might get to them in a week or two. Set yourself up, give yourself a goal. Write 5 minutes a day or write an hour a week, but get started on it, because our lives are a bunch of little stories that don't take long to tell, but they can be immensely interesting and impactful on your children, your nieces, your nephews, your grandchildren. They really do want to hear the story.
Well, as we bring the interview to a close, I do want to hit on one more topic, which is people who write blogs. And I think that it's one of those new terms that's out there in our cyber universe, and people hear about bloggers, they hear about people writing for blogs. And what is a blog? How do you as a writer, what would you say, how would you paraphrase and explain what a blog is? And then what is your perspective on using a blog as a tool for becoming, quote, a writer?
I hadn't considered it for very long, but I certainly am aware that it's become another vehicle for opinion and support. So I think it would be a great idea for people to give an opinion or their life experience or support through a blog. I certainly would be willing to do it. My husband would tell you that I have lots of opinions on lots of things and I'd like to write about them. So I think it's a great venue, especially now when there's so much going on right now that people can put their thoughts to and their ideas.
Well, you just gave me the best short definition of a blog. Thank you. A place where you can write about an opinion or a statement of support. I love that. And you're right, there is so much going on in our domestic space, in our international space. It's hard to think that someone would not have some opinion or something that they might want to commit to writing. Have you had any exposure or opportunity to view different dedicated blogs online that for women or for special interests, anything that you've noted that uh, where you might direct someone,
I
or
have
even about writing for a blog? Have you found any instruction on writing for a
I
blog?
I have not. I have not. The only experience I've had lately is the request for submissions about COVID and the pandemic by the Maryland Historical Association, and then the Eastern Shore Writers Association, which I just joined. They were looking for input about the pandemic for their anthology, Bay to Ocean anthology. One of my articles was accepted for that, so I'm pleased about that, because it was about a wish list for the pandemic, and that is something that I would probably put on a blog. But I will be looking at that.
Well, thank you. You've been a wealth of information in such a short period of time, and I would like to invite you to consider writing for our blog on trailblazersimpact.com. When you were talking about that you first got started recently on writing for blog around COVID-19, that's also one of the areas where we have been inviting our guests to consider writing something about COVID-19, or just, again, things that are going on. And that's why I loved your definition of a way to express your opinion or statement of support for something. And I'm now going to be doing more research myself into how to become a blogger, but it looks like it's very easy. And pretty much, I don't even know that there's rules other than what the submission requirements may be from the persons or entities that are doing the outreach. So you gave an example of was it Eastern Shore?
Eastern Shore Writers Association, and then the Maryland Historical Association. They're looking for things for their archives.
Good. And using the example of the Maryland Historical Association,
Mm-hmm.
what were some of the just one or two of the guidelines that they gave for writing to submit to them?
Your experiences during COVID, how you're coping with it, what has it meant to you and your family? And it resonated with me because I had read about the pandemic of 1918, and there are many memoirs published from that time that were interesting.
Okay, and so they're replicating that now 100 years later, trying to capture stories about how people living through this pandemic at this time feel, and they're capturing them in the context of a blog.
A time capsule kind of
And
thing.
a time capsule. Oh, I love that. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. I said you've been a wealth of information this morning, and I so appreciate your participation as a guest on trailblazersimpact.com. I'm also looking forward to a future interview with you where the two of us can talk about our experience as members of the anti-racism discussion group through the Peer Learning Partnership. And third, I'm looking forward to receiving from you something that we can post on our blog, whether it's around COVID-19 or how to write your memoirs or any of the other things that you're passionate about. So thank you so much, Karen, for devoting the time this morning, contributing your expertise, and I think being a cheerleader for those of us that have been sitting on the sidelines for years saying, I'm going to write my memoirs one day, and we don't do anything about it. Is there any particular book? I would say the last thing, is there any particular book that you use with your classes that if somebody wanted to read something, again, about how to get started or a format or anything like that, is there a particular text or just a reference book that you would recommend that someone buy and read to get started?
There are many, but the title of my memoir writing class is How to Write About Your Life, Writing About Your Life by William Zinsser. And it's a wonderful collection of his memoirs, not all of them, but he uses examples and he guides you through the process. But there are many available at bookstores now, many more than I ever remember. So it's obviously become a quest for many people to do, to write their memoirs, but there is a lot available. But
Thank you.
it's
That was
a good source.
That was a good description. So, Writing Your Memoirs by William Zinsser, and you said it sort of lays out a blueprint or something to follow.
Yes, writing about your life. Yes.
Oh, Writing About Your Life by William Zinsser. Okay, thank you again so much, Karen, and have a great day. And no, I look forward to reading something that you submit to us for the blog and talking with you again in the future on trailblazersimpact.com.
Thank you, Dee. It's been a pleasure.